I spent 34 years being the daughter who never complained, the one who worked 3 jobs through college while my sister maxed out credit cards our mother paid off, the one who built a career in silence while my family barely noticed I existed. So when I finally found a man who chose me, when I was one day away from wearing white and starting my own family, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd finally be seen. I was wrong. The night before my wedding, my mother stood up at the rehearsal dinner, silenced the room, and said 7 words that shattered everything. "Caitlin, give the groom to your sister." 18 faces stared at me. My fiancé wouldn't meet my eyes. My sister's hand moved to her stomach, 4 months pregnant, I'd later learn, with his child. And in that moment of complete humiliation, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, quiet. Because what none of them knew, what even I didn't fully understand yet, was that my father had left me something 17 years ago, something my mother had been hiding, something that would change everything. Have you ever been the one your family expected to just absorb the pain and keep smiling? My name is Caitlin Spencer. I'm 34 years old, a senior vice president at one of Boston's most respected financial advisory firms, and I built every inch of my career with my own 2 hands. But none of that ever seemed to matter to the people who were supposed to love me most. I was 17 when my father died. A heart attack on a Thursday afternoon, gone before the ambulance arrived. I remember standing in the hospital hallway, still wearing my school uniform, trying to understand how the world could just keep moving when mine had completely stopped. My father had been my safe place, the one person who looked at me like I was enough exactly as I was. His last words to me, spoken just days before, played on loop in my mind for years afterward. "I've made sure you'll be taken care of, sweetheart, no matter what happens." I clung to that promise like a lifeline. I had no idea it was more than just a dying man's comfort. Within 3 months of his funeral, my mother sat me down and explained that my father had left us with nothing but debt. The college fund I'd been counting on was gone, used to pay off my younger sister Megan's credit card bills. "Your sister needed it more," my mother said, as if that explained everything. "You're smart. You'll figure it out." I was grieving, trusting, and desperate to keep what was left of my family together. So I didn't question it. I just figured it out. I worked 3 jobs through community college. I transferred to a state university on a partial scholarship and student loans. I graduated, got hired, got promoted, and kept climbing. Every rung of that ladder was earned through late nights and early mornings, and the stubborn refusal to let my circumstances define me. By 34, I had a corner office, a healthy savings account, and the kind of professional reputation that opened doors. But whenever I shared good news with my mother, she'd look at me with something I could never quite name. Not pride, something colder, something that felt like resentment. "You're just like your father," she'd say, and it never sounded like a compliment. My sister Megan was 5 years younger and lived in a different universe. She'd never held a job longer than 6 months. She lived in an apartment our mother paid for, drove a car our mother financed, and had never once heard the word no from anyone in our family. I used to tell myself the favoritism made sense somehow, that Megan was the baby, that she needed more help. But the older I got, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. I succeeded, and my mother looked away. Megan failed, and my mother opened her arms. Then I met Daniel. He was 37, charming, ambitious, and he looked at me like I was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. He owned a small real estate development company that was struggling to find its footing. I introduced him to 3 clients who became his biggest accounts. I co-signed a $200,000 business loan when the banks wouldn't trust him alone. I connected him with my law school roommate, who became his business attorney. I did all of this because I loved him, because I believed in him, because when he said, "Without you, I'm nothing," I heard devotion. I didn't hear the truth hiding inside those words. The night before I left for Connecticut to prepare for our wedding, I woke at 2 in the morning to the glow of his phone on the nightstand. A text notification. The contact name was just the letter M with a small heart emoji beside it. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was nothing. His mother. A client named Michael. Anything but what some part of me already knew. I had spent 34 years hoping someone in my family would finally choose me. I wasn't ready to believe that the man I was about to marry might not choose me either. I should have looked closer. At the phone, at Daniel, at the way my mother smiled when I told her I was engaged, like she was already planning something I couldn't see. The week passed in a blur of dress fittings and seating charts and phone calls with vendors. I arrived at my mother's house in Connecticut on Friday afternoon, expecting the usual tension that came with being under her roof. What I got instead was something far worse. An hour before the rehearsal dinner was supposed to begin, while I was upstairs fixing my makeup, my mother appeared in the doorway and asked me to come to the study. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes from rehearsal. I followed her down the stairs and into my father's old study, the room she'd redecorated the month after he died, erasing every trace of him from the shelves and walls. She closed the door behind us and stood with her back against it, blocking my exit. "There's something you need to know," she said. "Megan is pregnant, 4 months along." I felt the words before I understood them, a physical sensation like being shoved backward. My mother continued, her tone never wavering. "Daniel is the father. They've been together for over a year. I know this is painful, but you need to step aside. Quietly, gracefully. The wedding tomorrow will be Megan's. Everything has already been arranged." I couldn't speak. My brain was trying to process what she was telling me, trying to make the pieces fit into some shape that made sense. Daniel, my Daniel. The man who had slept beside me last night, who had kissed me goodbye at the airport, who was supposed to stand at the altar tomorrow and promise me forever. He had been sleeping with my sister for over a year. He had gotten her pregnant, and my mother had known. My mother had planned this moment, rehearsed these words, and waited until the night before my wedding to deliver them. "You can't be serious," I finally managed. "This is insane. This is my wedding." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Megan needs this more than you do. She's going to be a mother. She needs stability. You have your career, your independence. You'll be fine. You always are. And what about what I need?" I heard my voice rising, cracking at the edges. "What about the fact that my fiancé has been cheating on me with my own sister?" That's when the mask slipped, just for a moment, but long enough for me to see what was underneath. "You've always been selfish," my mother said, and her voice had turned cold in a way I'd never heard before. "Just like your father. He wanted to leave me with nothing, and now you want to humiliate your sister in front of the whole family. But this time, Caitlin, you don't get to win." Before I could respond, she opened the door and walked out, leaving me alone in that room with the walls pressing in around me. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to remember how to breathe. Then I heard car doors closing, outside voices in the foyer, the sounds of family arriving for dinner. I had a choice to make. I could hide up here and let my mother control the narrative, or I could walk downstairs and face whatever was waiting for me. I chose to walk. The dining room was full when I entered. 18 people seated around my mother's long mahogany table, aunts and uncles and cousins I saw only at holidays and funerals. Daniel was there, seated near the head of the table, and Megan was beside him. She was wearing a soft pink dress that draped gently over a belly I now realized had a slight curve I'd somehow missed. Everyone turned to look at me as I came in, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the conversation in the study. Maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Then my mother stood up and tapped her wine glass with a spoon. "Before we eat," she announced, her voice warm and gracious, the perfect hostess, "I have some wonderful news to share. Our Megan is going to be a mother." She paused for the murmurs of surprise and congratulation. "And the father is Daniel. I know this is unexpected, but love works in mysterious ways. We're going to embrace this blessing as a family." I watched Daniel's face as my mother spoke. He didn't look at me. Not once. He just nodded along like this was perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, and reached over to take my sister's hand. My sister, who was carrying his child. My sister, who had been sleeping with him since before he put a ring on my finger. The math hit me like ice water. 4 months pregnant. Together for over a year. He had proposed to me 8 months ago. That meant he was already with Megan when he got down on one knee and asked me to spend my life with him. The engagement ring on my finger suddenly felt like something obscene, a prop in a play I hadn't known I was performing. I looked around the table, searching for one face that reflected the horror I was feeling. My uncle was studying his wine glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. My aunt was whispering something to my cousin, both of them carefully avoiding my gaze. No one was shocked. No one was angry on my behalf. They had all known. Every single person at this table had come tonight knowing what was about to happen, and not one of them had warned me, Finally, my Aunt Linda spoke up. "You're strong, Caitlin. You'll find someone else." And my uncle added, "Think about the baby. It needs a father." The message was clear. I was supposed to step aside. I was supposed to sacrifice my wedding, my fiancé, my future, because Megan needed it more. Because Megan was pregnant. Because that's what I had always done, absorbed the pain and kept smiling so everyone else could be comfortable. Something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, burning like acid in my chest, but something else was rising up alongside it. Something cold and clear and sharp. I looked directly at Daniel. "Tell me one thing," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Did my mother promise you that I'd keep helping your business? Even after this?" His face changed. Just for a second, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before he could hide it. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. That was all I needed to know. I turned to my mother. "What did Dad really leave behind? Because I don't believe it was nothing but bills." The color drained from Patricia's face. It happened so fast that anyone who blinked would have missed it, but I was watching closely. I saw the flash of fear in her eyes before she covered it with indignation. "How dare you bring your father into this?" she said, but her voice had lost its steadiness. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just picked up my purse from the side table where I'd left it, walked through the silent dining room, and let myself out the front door. Behind me, I could hear my mother calling my name, hear the chairs scraping as people stood up, hear Megan starting to cry. I didn't look back. I got in my rental car and drove. Not to the hotel where my suitcases were waiting, not to the airport. I drove to a 24-hour shipping store I'd passed on the way from the airport, the kind of place that has computers you can rent by the hour. I needed to find an address I hadn't thought about in years. A P.O. box in Virginia belonging to my Aunt Helen, my father's sister, the woman my mother had systematically cut out of our lives. That night, I didn't cry. I made phone calls instead. To my attorney in Boston, to my bank, to a number in Virginia that rang 6 times before a sleepy voice answered. By morning, I would know the truth about what my father had left behind, and why my mother had spent 17 years making sure I never found it. Aunt Helen answered on the 6th ring, her voice thick with sleep. When I told her who I was and what had happened, the sleepiness vanished. "Oh, honey," she said, and there was something in her tone that told me she had been waiting for this call for a very long time. "There's so much I need to tell you. Things I should have told you years ago, but your mother made sure we never had the chance." What Helen revealed over the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my life. My father had created a trust fund for me before his death, substantial enough to pay for college, and then some held by a bank trustee with specific instructions. The trust was designed to activate upon my marriage or my 35th birthday, whichever came first. For 17 years, the trustee had been sending annual notices and statements to my home address, the address listed on all my father's documents, which was my mother's house in Connecticut. Patricia had intercepted every single one. She had hidden the trust's existence from me for nearly 2 decades, letting me believe my father left nothing behind while I worked 3 jobs just to afford community college. But that wasn't the worst of it. Helen's voice grew heavy as she continued. 2 months before my father's fatal heart attack, he had consulted a divorce attorney. He had discovered something about Patricia, something Helen didn't know the details of. But it was serious enough that he wanted out. The trust wasn't just a gift, it was protection. He knew what Patricia was capable of, and he wanted to make sure I would be taken care of even if he wasn't there to protect me himself. "He was going to tell you everything that weekend," Helen said. "He called me the Thursday before he died and said he'd finally made up his mind. He was going to explain about the trust, about the divorce, about all of it. And then Friday morning, he was gone." I sat in my rental car in that shipping store parking lot, phone pressed to my ear, and finally understood the shape of my entire life. The stolen college fund, the constant criticism of every boyfriend I'd ever had, the relentless favoritism toward Megan, the way my mother looked at me with cold resentment whenever I succeeded. None of it was about Megan being weaker or needier. It was about keeping me unmarried and unaware. If I never got married, the trust would stay dormant until I turned 35. My mother had 11 more months to figure out how to keep me from claiming what my father left me. But I had gotten engaged. I had set a wedding date. So she found another way to stop it. She gave my groom to my sister. I didn't sleep that night. I drove back to Boston, and was waiting outside my attorney's office when she arrived at 8 in the morning. By 10, I had a plan. By noon on Saturday, while my sister was walking down the aisle in a white dress she had apparently kept on standby for exactly this occasion, I was signing documents that would change everything. The wedding happened without me. I learned the details later from Helen, who heard them through family connections. Only 18 people attended the same 18 who had watched me be humiliated at that dinner table. My friends and colleagues had received messages supposedly from me saying the wedding was postponed due to a family emergency. Patricia told everyone that I had graciously stepped aside for my sister's happiness once I learned about the pregnancy. She painted me as noble and self-sacrificing, the perfect cover story. Daniel apparently looked relieved throughout the ceremony. Megan cried happy tears. By noon, she was Mrs. Daniel Whitmore, and everyone pretended this was exactly how things were supposed to be. I spent that weekend making phone calls. Not angry calls, calm, professional, methodical calls. I contacted the bank that held Daniel's business loan, the one I had co-signed because no institution would trust him on his own merits. I informed them that I would be initiating the process to remove myself as guarantor. They explained that Daniel would have 45 days to find alternative collateral or face accelerated repayment of the full amount. I thanked them politely and hung up. Then I called my law school friend Rebecca, who had become Daniel's business attorney because I had introduced them at a dinner party 3 years ago. I told her what had happened, all of it, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying she would be withdrawing her representation effective immediately. She apologized for not seeing who he really was. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. None of us had seen it. We had all believed what we wanted to believe. Monday morning, Daniel returned from his brief honeymoon to discover his world falling apart. His attorney was gone, his loan was in jeopardy, and 2 of his 3 major clients, both of whom I had personally introduced him to over dinners and networking events, called to inform him they would not be renewing their contracts. The conversations were brief and professional. They didn't explain their reasons. They didn't have to. Daniel finally understood what I had known all along, but refused to see his company was never really his. It was a house I had built for him brick by brick, connection by connection, and he had just been living in it. I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply no longer building. 5 days after the wedding, I drove back to Connecticut. Not to cry or scream or beg for explanations. I had moved past that. I went because there were things that needed to be said, and I wanted to say them face to face. When I walked into my mother's living room, all 3 of them were there. Patricia sitting rigid in her armchair. Daniel pacing by the window, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Megan curled up on the sofa, one hand resting on her stomach, tears already streaming down her face. I placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside were copies of the trust documents, the annual notices the trustee had sent to this very house for 17 years, and a letter from my father that Helen had kept safe all this time. I opened the letter and read one line aloud. For my Caitlin, because I know what she'll face when I'm gone, and I won't let her face it with nothing. I looked at my mother. 17 years, I said. You stole 17 years of my life trying to keep me from what Dad left me. You let me work 3 jobs through college while you hid the money he set aside for my education. You criticized every relationship I ever had, hoping I'd stay single long enough for you to figure out how to take what was mine. And when I finally found someone, when I finally got close to triggering the trust, you gave him to Megan instead. I paused. Not because you needed the money, but because you couldn't stand that Dad protected me from you. Patricia's face was white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Daniel stepped forward. Caitlin, please, we can work something out. The business, the loan. I just need a little more time. I turned to him. I'm not taking anything from you, Daniel. I'm just no longer giving you what was never yours. Finally, I looked at my sister sobbing in the corner, mascara running down her cheeks. You didn't win, Megan. You inherited my burden. Good luck carrying it. I left the trust documents on the table. I would claim what was mine through proper legal channels. I didn't need to fight or scheme or manipulate. I just needed to stop sacrificing myself for people who had never once sacrificed anything for me. I walked out of that house knowing I would probably never walk back in. And for the first time in 17 years, that felt exactly right. I didn't tear them down. I simply stopped holding them up, and gravity, as it always does, took care of the rest. The weeks that followed were quiet for me. I went back to work, threw myself into projects I had been neglecting, and slowly began to feel like myself again. Not the self I had been before, the one who gave endlessly and asked for nothing but someone new. Someone who understood that my worth wasn't measured by how much I sacrificed for people who would never sacrifice anything for me. But for the people I left behind in that Connecticut living room, nothing was quiet at all. I heard about what happened through Helen, who still had connections in the community, and occasionally through messages from distant relatives who seemed torn between gossip and genuine concern. I didn't seek out information about their downfall, but it found its way to me nonetheless. Daniel's company began collapsing within weeks of my departure from his life. The two major accounts I had personally introduced him to, relationships I had built over dinners and networking events, and years of professional trust, quietly declined to renew their contracts. They didn't make dramatic announcements or cite specific reasons. They simply moved on to other developers, ones who came with their own reputations and their own connections. Without those accounts, Daniel's revenue dropped by nearly 60% overnight. He scrambled to replace them, making cold calls and sending proposals to anyone who might listen, but he quickly discovered something he had never wanted to admit. His success had never been about his talent or his vision. It had been about proximity to me. He managed to find a new guarantor for his bank loan, his own mother, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy, who had spent 30 years saving modest amounts from her modest salary. She mortgaged her home to save her son's business, believing his assurances that this was just a temporary setback. I felt genuine sympathy for her when I heard. She had no idea what she was getting into, no understanding that the money wouldn't fix anything because the problem had never been the money. Daniel's entire business model depended on connections he didn't have and couldn't make on his own. He had spent 3 years coasting on my network, my reputation, my quiet endorsements. Without those things, he was just another developer with a track record of losses and a history of overpromising. By the 8th week, he was laying off staff and couldn't afford to renew his office lease. The bank was asking uncomfortable questions about repayment. And through it all, he grew more bitter with each passing day, blaming everyone except himself. He blamed the economy. He blamed his former clients for disloyalty. He blamed me for being vindictive, even though all I had done was stop giving. Helen told me that Megan overheard him on a phone call one evening about 6 weeks after the wedding. He was talking to an old college friend, and Megan was standing in the hallway listening through the partially open door. I had everything set up, Daniel said, his voice heavy with self-pity. I was 6 months away from being set for life. The business was finally turning around. All I had to do was marry her and keep my head down for a few more years. One decision, and it's all gone. He wasn't talking about business strategy. He was talking about me, about choosing Megan over Caitlin, about betting on the wrong sister and losing everything. Megan told Helen about that phone call during a tearful conversation days later. She had reached out to Helen because she had no one else. Her friends had distanced themselves after the scandal spread. Her mother was drowning in her own problems, and her husband couldn't look at her without resentment flickering across his face. Daniel had never loved either of us, Megan realized. He had loved what I provided. Megan was just the backup plan, the consolation prize he settled for when the real prize walked away. Without my resources propping him up, he was exactly what he had always been. Ambition without foundation. A man who needed someone else's strength to stand. Megan's awakening came slowly and painfully. The romantic fantasy she had constructed, the story where she rescued Daniel from a loveless engagement with her cold sister, crumbled more each day. He was irritable, constantly snapping at her over small things. He stayed out late without explanation and came home smelling like whiskey. He blamed her for the pregnancy, even though she had done exactly what their mother instructed. The fairy tale prince she thought she had won was just a desperate man who had gambled everything on a scheme that fell apart the moment I stopped playing my assigned role. During one vicious argument about money, Megan finally confessed something she had been carrying since before the wedding. "Mom told me to do it," she sobbed. "She came to me over a year ago and said Daniel was perfect for our family, that he just needed to be with the right sister. She said if I gave him a baby, he would have to stay. She said Caitlin would keep helping anyway, because that's what Caitlin does. She said you would never actually walk away." It wasn't an apology, it was blame-shifting, the desperate attempt of someone who had never learned responsibility. But it confirmed what I had suspected. Every piece had been orchestrated. The affair, The pregnancy, the timing. My mother had arranged it all. Megan sent me a message a few days later. "I'm sorry, I need help. Please." I stared at those words for a long time, searching for something genuine underneath some evidence of real remorse. But all I found was desperation wearing a thin mask of apology. She wasn't sorry for betraying me. She was sorry her life wasn't working out. I didn't respond. Not that day. Not ever. Some people only reach out when they have exhausted every other option, and that kind of love isn't worth having. My mother's downfall was perhaps the most complete. The daughter she had spent decades favoring now blamed her for everything. "You ruined my life," Megan screamed during one visit. "You promised he loved me." The son-in-law Patricia had hand-selected despised her openly. "You guaranteed she would keep helping," Daniel accused. Patricia had built her scheme on one fatal assumption that I would remain passive forever. She had miscalculated badly. The story spread through their Connecticut community like wildfire. Not because I told anyone, but 18 people had witnessed that rehearsal dinner. And secrets that explosive don't stay contained. Old friends stopped returning Patricia's calls. Women she had known for decades avoided her in public. The carefully cultivated image she had spent years constructing collapsed under the weight of truth. She spent her savings helping Megan cover rent, then started selling jewelry, then her car. She sat alone in a house full of family photographs that now felt like accusations. Helen drove up from Virginia to spend a weekend with me about 10 weeks after everything fell apart. We sat in my apartment with coffee while she filled in the final pieces. "Your father called me the week before he died," she said quietly. "He told me Patricia had discovered the trust documents and the divorce papers. They had a terrible fight. He was going to tell you everything that weekend. He wanted you to understand that you were protected." But Thursday morning came first. A heart attack gone before anyone could help. By Monday, Patricia had found the divorce paperwork and destroyed every trace. The trust remained untouchable, managed by a bank beyond her reach, but she ensured I would never know to look for it. 17 years of manipulation built on one terrible week. Before Helen left, she handed me a small wooden box she had kept safe all those years. Inside lay my father's watch, the one he wore every day of my childhood. His wedding ring from his first marriage before Patricia, to a woman who died young, and a photograph edges soft with age of my father holding me as a baby. He was looking down at my tiny face with an expression I recognized immediately. Pure, uncomplicated love. "He saw who you were from the very beginning," Helen said. "He would be so proud of who you've become." I held that photograph for hours after Helen drove away, studying my father's face, trying to remember the sound of his laugh. 10 weeks after losing the wedding, the fiancé and the family I had spent my entire life trying to deserve, I finally understood something that changed everything. I hadn't actually lost anything real. I had simply stopped auditioning for people who were never going to give me the part. 8 months after the wedding, that never was my life looked nothing like I had imagined it would. It looked better. The promotion came through in March, a recognition that had been building for years, but somehow felt sweeter now that I understood it was entirely mine. I was leading our firm's largest institutional client portfolio, managing relationships with pension funds and endowments that represented billions in assets. My boss told me I was on track for partner within 2 years. For once, I accepted the compliment without deflecting, without that familiar voice in my head insisting I didn't deserve it. I had earned every bit of it through late nights and difficult conversations and the stubborn refusal to let my circumstances define my ceiling. I used part of my father's trust fund as a down payment on a condo overlooking Boston Harbor, floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with light, a kitchen big enough to actually cook in a view of the water that still took my breath away each morning. The rest of the money I divided carefully. Half went into retirement savings, the kind of long-term security my father would have wanted for me. The other half I used to establish a scholarship fund at my alma mater for first-generation college students, young people working multiple jobs like I once did, trying to build futures without anyone's help. I named it after my father. It felt like the right way to honor what he had tried to give me by passing it forward to others who needed the same kind of faith someone believed in them. I started dating again in the spring. His name was James, a pediatric surgeon. I met at a charity event for the Children's Hospital. He was kind in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. He made me laugh, really laugh, for the first time in longer than I could remember. He showed up when he said he would, called when he promised to call, and never once made me feel like I needed to earn his attention or prove my worth. We took things slowly, dinner dates and long walks along the harbor, and conversations that stretched past midnight without either of us watching the clock. I wasn't rushing toward anything. For the first time in my 34 years, I was choosing based on what I wanted, not what I was afraid to lose. Patricia appeared at my building on a rainy Tuesday in April. I was coming home from work, umbrella in one hand and takeout in the other, when I saw her standing near the entrance. She looked like she had aged a decade in 8 months. Thinner than I had ever seen her, her hair more gray than blonde, now exhaustion carved into every line of her face. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, something cheaper than her usual style, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. "Caitlin," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "Please, I just need 5 minutes." I didn't invite her upstairs. We stood in the lobby, the doorman pretending not to watch from his desk, rain streaking down the windows behind us. Patricia cried. She apologized. She said things I had waited my entire life to hear. I was wrong about everything. I was so angry at your father, and I took it out on you for years. I couldn't stand that he loved you more, that he tried to protect you from me. I told myself I was just looking out for Megan, but I was punishing you for being his daughter. Please, Caitlin, you're all I have left. I listened without interrupting. I let her say everything she needed to say. And when she finished, when she stood there with mascara running down her cheeks and hope flickering in her eyes, I spoke as gently as I could manage. "I believe you're sorry, Mom. I really do. I can see that these months have been hard, and I think some part of you genuinely understands what you did." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But I can't go back to being your foundation while you keep building on top of me. I spent 34 years hoping you would see me, really see me, not as a resource or a rival or a reminder of Dad, but as your daughter. You didn't. You couldn't. And that's not something either of us can fix by pretending it never happened." She reached for my hand, but I stepped back, not cruelly, just clearly. "There's a therapist in Hartford who specializes in family estrangement," I said. "I'll text you her information. I think she could help you understand some things, maybe find some peace with all of this." I met my mother's eyes one last time. "I hope you figure it out, Mom. I really do. But I can't be part of that process. I have to protect the life I've built." Then I walked past her to the elevator, pressed the button for my floor, and gently let the doors close between us. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't triumphant. It was just necessary. I learned about the others through Helen, who kept me informed without my having to ask. Daniel and Megan separated after 5 months of marriage, their relationship crumbling under the weight of debt and disappointment, and the obvious truth that they had never actually loved each other. The divorce was still pending, complicated by the baby and the financial wreckage Daniel left behind. His company officially dissolved in June. He was working now as a real estate agent, not a developer, just an agent at a small firm in New Jersey. According to Helen, he told anyone who would listen that his former wife's family had destroyed him, that he was the victim of vindictive women who couldn't handle rejection. He would probably believe that story until the day he died. Megan had her baby in July, a girl she named Lily. She lived in a small apartment, now worked as an administrative assistant at a medical office, and was learning slowly and painfully that survival required effort. She had reached out to me 3 more times since that first desperate message, each request more urgent than the last. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty or vengeance, but out of clarity. Helping Megan had never actually helped Megan. Every time someone rescued her, it just delayed the moment when she would have to rescue herself. That moment had finally arrived. I hoped in a distant and detached way that she would figure it out, that she would learn to stand on her own feet and become someone Lily could look up to. But it wasn't my responsibility to make that happen. It never had been. Thanksgiving that year was different from any I had known before. I spent it with Aunt Helen, who drove up from Virginia with a trunk full of dishes and stories about my father. 2 cousins from his side of the family came as well, people I had barely known growing up because Patricia had systematically isolated me from anyone who might tell me the truth. And James was there, fitting into the group as easily as if he had always belonged. We crowded around my small dining table, eating food that was simple, but made with love, laughing at old family stories and feeling something I couldn't quite name until Helen put it into words. She raised her glass near the end of the meal, and waited for everyone to quiet down. To your father, she said, looking directly at me, who always knew exactly who you were from the very first moment he held you. And to you, Caitlin, for finally believing him. I looked around the table at the faces gathered there. Helen with her warm eyes and ready laugh, my cousins who had welcomed me into their lives without hesitation or conditions, James who reached under the table to squeeze my hand. These people weren't here because they needed something from me. They weren't waiting for me to sacrifice or shrink or make myself smaller so they could feel bigger. They were just here, present, choosing me because they wanted to, not because of what I could give them. I didn't feel like I had won. I didn't feel like my mother and sister and Daniel had lost. I just felt for the first time in 34 years like I was exactly where I belonged. I didn't get the wedding I had planned. I didn't get the fiancé I had trusted or the family I had spent my whole life begging to love me. But I got something better. A life built on my own terms, surrounded by people who chose me without conditions. My father had tried to tell me all those years ago in those last words I had carried like a talisman without understanding their true meaning. I just hadn't been ready to hear it. Now finally I understood. Sometimes losing everything you thought you needed is the only way to find what you actually deserve. And so we come to the end of Caitlin's story, a story that began with heartbreak and humiliation with a mother's betrayal, and a sister's selfishness, and a man who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to success. But it ended somewhere far more beautiful. It ended with freedom, with self-respect, and with the quiet peace that comes from finally choosing yourself after a lifetime of being chosen last. There are lessons here for all of us, no matter our age or circumstances. The first is this: your worth is not determined by how much you sacrifice for people who would never sacrifice anything for you. Caitlin spent 34 years giving and giving, hoping that if she just loved hard enough, her family would love her back. But love that has to be earned isn't really love at all. It's a transaction, and you deserve better than that. The second lesson is equally important: boundaries are not betrayal. When Caitlin stopped helping Daniel, stopped rescuing Megan, stopped allowing her mother to manipulate her, she wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. She was finally saying through her actions that she mattered too. Setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It makes you wise. And the third lesson, perhaps the most important of all, sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to keep. Caitlin found her real family in Aunt Helen, in her father's memory, in cousins she barely knew, and in a man named James who loved her without conditions. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Actions do. If this story touched your heart, if you saw pieces of yourself in Caitlin's journey, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We share stories like this every week and the courage it takes to rebuild your life when everything falls apart. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from family members who hurt you? Have you ever had to choose yourself after years of being everyone else's foundation? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are worthy of love that doesn't cost you your peace.